So, you want to become a doctor. Cool. As if the Leaving Cert isn't hard enough already, there's a whole other exam standing between you and doing medicine in college. That's right. It's called the HPAT. But don't worry, today we're going to be breaking down exactly what it is, why it exists, and how to actually prepare for it. Welcome to FrameX Studios. I'm your host, Grace Maria. And today we have a very special guest with us, Hammad from Grinds 360, to give us a deep dive. Hello, Hammad. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Grace. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So I think it's best that we start with the very basics, because I'm sure there are people listening to us who've probably heard of the HPAT, but they don't know exactly what it is. So what actually is the HPAT?
So the HPAT's an additional exam you have to do to get into medicine in the undergraduate pathway in Ireland. It's an online exam you have to sit in February of whichever year you're applying. You have to do it in sixth year. And if you apply to undergraduate medicine after sixth year, you have to do the HPAT in the year you apply.
Okay, so to me, what I understand of the HPAT is that it's something more than just academic knowledge.
Yep.
So it's not actually an additional biology or chemistry exam. So what is it actually testing?
So they actually state in their booklet that they give every candidate for the HPAT that they're not testing any academic knowledge. So as you said, it's got nothing to do with any scientific information. What they say is they're testing skills and characteristics that are associated with a competent health professional. So in other words, they're testing the skills that go into making a good doctors, basically.
So if it's not testing academic knowledge, what actually is it testing?
So what it tests are things like decision making or managing time pressure, or even in some ways evaluating empathy. So what they use is different question types in different sections. And yes, they're testing in section 1, say, logical reasoning. But a lot of what they're testing is when you're under pressure, as all doctors are basically all the time, can you still think properly and safely? So things like critical thinking, time management, empathy, people skills, it's these kind of things.
Okay, so these sort of skills, they're not really tested, at a great level at school. So what is the format of this exam? Is it essay questions, a lot of writing, multiple choice?
Yeah, so the online is an online exam. So it's been online since COVID pretty much. So it's an online MCQ exam, which means multiple choice. So there's 3 sections for all undergraduate applicants, and there's a 4th section, which is essay writing, but that's not applicable for undergrads. It's only for postgrad students using the HPAT to apply for courses like speech and language therapy, or the Masters in Speech and Language Therapy in Limerick. So section 1, it tests logical reasoning and problem solving. Section 2 tests understanding people, so kind of interpersonal skills and empathy. And section 3, which people might be familiar with as the puzzle section, that tests non-verbal reasoning. So your kind of pattern recognition, basically.
Okay, I understand. So now that we've looked at, the basic format of the exam and what the HPAT actually is, I think the next big question that a lot of students will have is, when do we start preparing? So what's your advice on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one I get all the time. So there is some difference, I suppose, in opinion between different people who've done the HPAT tutors. But my general suggestion is to start anywhere between kind of August and October of the year you're going to sit the HPAT. So in other words, if you're going into 6th year, starting anytime from basically now until Halloween, in my experience is the kind of quote unquote right time to study. And the main reason I say that is because starting any earlier than that, I haven't found either my own experience or in the experience of, at this point, the tens and hundreds of students I've taught, that by the time you get to the exam in February, starting in kind of March of 5th year, it doesn't really make any difference. And it's not like all the students who do the best all start the earliest. So that's kind of why any time really between August and October, or August and Halloween pretty much, I think it's a pretty good place to start.
Okay, because that's a really good point. I think I've heard a lot of people start, as early as transition year or start of 5th year. So that is a really good point, because I've heard a lot of students start much earlier, as early as the end of the junior cycle exam or transition year. So to bring up the point that starting just before 6th year and working your way through, that's really key advice.
Yeah, exactly. Because what I found is, in my experience, when students start in 5th year at any point, let alone before that, it's very rare that you get to February of sixth year, i.e. when you do the HPAT, it's very rare to get to that stage and think, I'm so happy I started as early as I did, or I'm so happy that because I started in, December of fifth year, that made my life really easy by the time I got to the HPAT. That just never happens. And unfortunately, the HPAT it is a really challenging exam, and it's really challenging in a way that pretty much every student has never faced before. So the reason why I usually say you don't need to start early is because the things that make it hard aren't solved by starting really early. And so in my opinion, there's no real benefit that's gained by starting early. And it's certainly, in my view, it doesn't kind of surpass the kind of opportunity cost of being, 15 studying for your HPAT, or 16 studying for your HPAT, or spending a big chunk of your fifth year when you're 16, 17, sat down for an exam that's 12 months away. When by the time you get to the exam, you're not going to be like, oh my goodness, I'm so happy I studied 13 months ago.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, that is a really good point. And I think my next question is, there's a lot of mock exams that are available for students to do. So how important are they, and how many should a student opt to do?
Yeah, so I usually recommend to use MedEntry, and they have a bunch of HPAT preparation materials, and they usually give 10 practice exams, and in my experience, those are generally enough. Now you can do more, and at Grant 360 we have practice exams that we give students as well. But I think a really key thing I'd love to get across to people is the HPAT's not about doing a certain amount of work and then you are guaranteed to get it. It's not like the Leaving Cert where if you do all the past papers, you're going to get your H1. You can do four practice HPAT exams and be fine because maybe your baseline is a bit higher than other people, or you just learn faster. And equally, you could do 20 practice exams. And if you don't use them properly, you'll just be in the same place you were when you started. So it's really important to be thinking not so much about the number of practice exams, but really think about the benefit you're getting from each practice exam, and then just keep going and space the practice exams out well enough. So maybe if you start around about now, you're probably talking about spreading 10 exams across maybe 2 a month / 1 every 3 weeks to kind of bring you in a nice uniform fashion all the way up to the exam, which is usually the second weekend of February. But it's not a case of you do 10 practice exams, that's you sorted, or a case of, if you've only done 7, you're not going to get it. It doesn't work like that at all.
Yeah. So you would say that the HPAT is really individualized, like it's based on where your skills lie, where your strengths and weaknesses are, more than just completing a set number of practice exams, or...
Yeah, in some respects, it's definitely individualized. That's definitely one of the reasons why it's so hard, because you're basically asking 17 and 18-year-olds, or maybe 19 if they're someone who's repeating the HPAT, for example, or 20, to be really kind of honed in on their own strengths and weaknesses and kind of continuously tailor what they're doing based on how they're going, basically, which itself is a really tough skill to develop. So it's very much important to go at a pace that makes sense for whatever your current level is, whilst also acknowledging that, you can't work off of somebody else's kind of timetable and just assume that it'll work for you. Whereas for the Leaving Cert, generally you can kind of do that. You can kind of assume if you factorize enough times, you'll kind of figure it out. You'll remember De Moivre's theorem after you write it out a few times. The HPAT is not like that at all.
Okay. And earlier you mentioned the sections within the HPAT. So what is section 1 exactly?
So section 1 tests, or it's called logical reasoning and problem solving. It's the first section on the exam. It lasts 60 minutes. There's 42 questions. So you have to work very quickly. It works out to about 7 questions every 10 minutes. And it is definitely in my opinion, the hardest section to deal with just time-wise. So the type of questions you get in that type of section could be just information about anything, any sort of problem. There could be some maths. It could be a graph, which is called data interpretation. And what a student is expected to do is to have no pre-existing knowledge about anything to do with the topic. Look at the information given in the time available and come up with reasonable inferences or conclusions based on the information given. And that might require using maths. It might require just using, your critical thinking, basically. That's kind of what it tests.
Yeah. So, when you're given these long passages, you're also under a lot of time pressure. I think a key concern that a lot of students have is how to finish reading those passages so quickly and being able to analyze based on the questions that are asked. So are there any sort of tips or any advice that you could give them?
Yeah, there's definitely a few. One of the first things, a very foundational thing that it's really important all students understand is HPAT reading and life reading are completely different. And then within the HPAT, section 1 reading, and then we might talk about it later, section 2 reading is again really different. So in section 1, the most important thing students need to realize is you're not supposed to understand everything. The examiner doesn't expect you to understand everything. And you have to accept that you will have to make decisions based off of a smaller percentage of the text than you'd like to understand, basically, which in many cases is what medicine boils down to. If the doctor had enough time, they would love to ask the patient about everything, about every symptom, when it started, when it stopped, what made it better. But the reality is doctors can't do that, so they are trained to ask specific questions to kind of narrow down their decision making. And section 1, in many respects, is very similar. You're given lots of information, and you've got to figure out, based on usually the wording of the questions and the answers, what might be important. And then when you're reading the potentially long stem, it can be short as well, not all of them are long. What you have to do is, using keywords you find in the question and the answers, speed up and slow down when you're reading the stem, like the big text. And that kind of tells you what's important and what's not. And a lot of section 1 boils down to your ability to do this, because as I said, the examiner doesn't expect you to read and understand everything. Only read and understand the things that are important to the question in front of you, basically.
Yeah, so section 1, we were talking about time pressure just there and being able to analyze and read, pay attention to what is most important.
Yeah.
So how does this come into section 2? What is section 2 about?
So section 2 is kind of completely different to section 1, and it is not in a coincidence, basically, that you go from thinking a very specific kind of logical, critical way, and then you straight away go into section 2. And in section 2, you're expected to be really empathetic and really emotionally sensitive to what's going on in the passages that you're reading. So you can kind of think of section 2 more as reading text from novels or the transcripts of conversations. And you're expected, based on whatever the question tells you, to think, how might John feel in line 7? Or what is John likely to say after line 14, or whatever it is. And for that, the thinking has to be very different. You have to pay attention to things like the body language that's written, the words that are mentioned, the emotional intensity of those words, things like that.
Yeah, so when we look at how a character is feeling or what they might say next, I feel that it could be kind of subjective. Like the options may seem, all of them may seem applicable, or 2 of them may seem very strong. So how does one improve on that?
Yeah, it's in many ways kind of the crux of section 2. It's the big problem that everybody has, which is you need to have a very good vocab. Objectively, you need to have a very good vocab for section 2. Some people, especially those who might have read a lot more as children, they might find it a little bit easier because their vocab is a bit better. But the main kind of fine print you need to keep in mind for section 2 vocab is you need to understand intensity as well as definitions. So a good example of this would be that practically in everyday life, if I told you I was annoyed, I was angry, and I was furious, practically you can kind of understand which one of those is the worst, but you don't really need to kind of express it in any way. But for the purposes of the HPAT, you need to know, why would John be annoyed? Why would John be angry? And why would James be, furious? So it's kind of knowing the difference, the little nuances between, like I said, the intensity of what words mean and what exactly they mean, because this is kind of how you can have a question, as you just said, where you have a pretty good understanding of what's going on, and all 4 words mean roughly the same thing. But because the wording that the examiners always use is the most correct answer in section 2, you really need to know what exactly the words mean to be able to identify what the most correct answer is. And then the other really important strategy to try and solve this problem for students is to be really good at understanding the question, because a lot of times, if you can understand exactly what the question is asking, exactly what the examiner wants you to figure out, then that will help you identify which of these words that all mean the same thing pretty much best answers the question, or the exact question that the exam is putting in front of you. Because again, both in real life and your whole academic career, usually reading the question in Leaving Cert exams is pretty easy. It's writing the answer that's hard. But in the HPAT, both of them are hard. So it's really important that students, like I said, there's a whole different skill to reading in the HPAT. There's a whole different skill to reading the question in the HPAT. And that's really, really important for section 2.
Yeah, and just coming back to what you were saying about the intensity of, different words. Oftentimes when we use it in everyday language, we don't really sit down and analyze the difference between the emotions. So under the time pressure, two of the options may seem really similar to us and we're just sitting there stuck. So would you advise keeping perhaps, I don't know, a diary of vocab, let's say, and being able to differentiate between words that may appear as synonyms to us in everyday language and being able to revise those so that when we're in a similar situation where we don't know the difference, it comes to us a bit faster?
Yeah, you definitely could do that. I remember doing that myself, and it does help. I mean, there are other kind of more effective ways you can use, like making flashcards using Quizlet or Anki. A lot of students now, I think, would use one or both of those things.
Yeah.
So you can use that. The whole point is no matter what method you use, a diary, flashcard, some third method, you need to be able to know exactly what the word that's in front of you means, and roughly how intense it is. And one kind of shortcut that I found that was quite helpful is when now it's changed because Google uses AI all the time now, but basically if you look up a word, whatever the first synonym that comes up, you can kind of keep that in your head and you can say like, okay, if I'm, let's say, unsettled, what exactly does that mean? If you can't remember exactly what the definition is, if you just think unsettled is kind of irritated but slightly different, if that's all you remember in the exam, that might be enough to realize, okay, it's not unsettled, it's something else. So even if you can't remember the intensity of the words, just having a synonym in your head, that can also help, I found.
Yeah, so section 1 and section 2 are quite different from each other.
Yeah.
They're testing obviously very different skills. So what is section 3? Is it something similar?
Section 3, again, is something completely different. So there's very little overlap definitely there's basically no overlap between section 2 and section 3. So section 1 and 2 are both worth 40% of the exam. Section 3 is worth 20%. And section 3 is you have 40 minutes to do 30 questions. So as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of the puzzles part of the exam, or what people might consider that. So it's called nonverbal reasoning. It's basically pattern recognition, which is really important for doctors because your entire job is pattern recognition, even if you're not always interpreting bloods or scans or MRIs and chest x-rays and so on. And in terms of what they're testing, well, they want to see if you can just see information in front of you, can you make sense of it with basically no other context? Can you use your skills that you know, certain strategies for how to figure out, say, one of the question types is next in the sequence. So if you see 4 kind of pictures that are all in a pattern, can you use your skills to try and figure out what the most sensible next in the sequence would be? That's kind of what they're testing.
So I think I've heard a lot of students say that section 3 is quite repetitive, as in once you figure out the strategy, it's common to all questions. So what is this about? Is this true?
To a degree, yeah, I would say it's true. So there's kind of 2 answers to this question, and I'll try and give both. So section 3 by its nature is repetitive because there's only so many sequences they can ask. There's only so many different patterns they can give you. And because there's so many different practice questions, say on med-entry, for example, you'll just get really good at spotting the common patterns. And that's why you can be really sharp at recognizing those common patterns in the actual exam. The second half of this answer, which is the much sadder answer, is that the examiners know this now. And I've thought this since pretty much my HPAT, and every year students constantly kind of, they constantly confirm it, which is nowadays I think the examiners know that students are really good at some of the more basic patterns. So what they're doing is they're adjusting the questions that come up so that they're kind of different, and that just doing lots and lots of practice questions doesn't always help. And they're changing it so that it becomes less about how good you are at the things that always come up and more about how good are you at figuring out a pattern that you might never have seen before. Because in some ways, that's kind of the only way to test how good students are at nonverbal reasoning, because now so many people are just so good at recognizing the simple stuff. They have to make the questions a bit weirder, basically, to prevent what you just said, which is, constantly the same questions coming up again and again.
Yeah. So we've discussed all 3 sections, and like you said, they're all different from each other. They're, making you apply different skills. And I think the next key question that a lot of students will have is, after all this practice, what is the sort of line that differentiates a student who receives the 50th percentile and, let's say, the 100th percentile?
Yeah, there's so many things that go into kind of elite HPAT performance, we'll say. It's almost easier to go the opposite, kind of reverse your question and say, like, what doesn't separate these people? And so one thing I would say is, like, there's no like, there's not an enormous difference between people in the 50th percentile and the 100th percentile. What I mean by that, it's not like everyone in the 100th percentile or over 95 is some super genius, amazing H1 in every exam they've ever done. They are all, by and large, just normal people who are quite good at studying for the HPAT. Generally speaking, the big difference between students, even just successful and unsuccessful students, is the quality of their study. So it's so much about making sure that every time you sit down and study HPAT, you're learning something new. That making sure that whatever time you can put in, that time quality is good and is high, and you can have a clear output that you can point towards and say, I spent an hour studying the HPAT and I learned this, or I'm better at this type of question. And if you do that over a period of hours and then weeks and then months, that's the kind of difference. That's the kind of thing, rather, that makes the difference in the end. Because one thing that's really important for everyone considering the HPAT to get into their minds is it's a really tough exam. And that's before you consider the only people who bother to do this exam are excellent students. So even to just be in the 50th percentile is objectively like a pretty good thing, because you're against a really strong cohort of students and you're doing okay. So to be all the way over to the right, to be amongst the best performers, you have to be really committed, but also make sure your study's really high quality. Because if it's not, and others are, I mean, they just will beat you. That's kind of the big difference between success and non-success in the HPAT, really.
Yeah, so something to take away from what you just said there is, when you're studying, to be super sort of reflective. As in, oftentimes when we're studying academically, we might just be learning off what's written in front of us or not really taking in what's there. But this is about being aware that, we actually take something out from what we've done that day, and to just place yourself in a good sort of circle mentally, really, to be aware that you're doing this with so many other students and what you've done so far is progress from what you've done the other day.
Yeah, definitely. To try and put it as simply as possible, you need to be really intentional and deliberate about the study that you're doing. And you need to be really aware of the quality of the study you're doing, because if you're not, it does not matter how much time you're putting in, you will not get the benefit that you're looking for. And if you do that and then show up to the HPAT against a similarly talented, not that talent really matters, but talented student, but they've been effective and you haven't, I mean, they'll destroy you on the exam, because the exam is designed to reward that person and punish you in this kind of hypothetical. That's basically what it is.
So this huge change that I've heard about on social media and articles is the changes that are being put forth for 2027 and onwards. So for students who have, heard bits online here and there, what is actually happening?
Yeah, so before, what they used to do is your Leaving Cert points would be capped at 550, and then all subsequent points would count differently. So it would be that every 5 points after 550 would count as 1 point. So basically, instead of getting 625 points for getting 65, it would count as 565, basically. So what they're doing, the first thing they're doing is they're changing that and getting rid of it, which means that for the applying to medicine, if you get 625, it counts as 625. So that's one huge change they're making. Specific to the HPAT generally is marked out of 300. They're changing that to mark it out of 150. And what that means in theory is that the HPAT is, if not half as important, it's definitely less important. And the kind of the big picture change in theory should be that the Leaving Cert becomes a lot more important, because before the logic used to be that, does it really matter if for someone to become a doctor if they can't do well in, say, French or Irish or English or whatever? And unfortunately, with these changes, it now really matters if you're good at your languages or really good at maths, or for example, because the people who get the 50th percentile, for example, like loads of them get 65, for example. So the big change for the HPAT is actually that the Leaving Cert has become somehow even more important.
Yeah, so how come they're changing it now? Like, why 2027?
To be honest, I don't fully know exactly, what spurred them to do this now. I think a big part of it is the medicine is often not representative kind of socioeconomically of the student population. It tends to be a profession, and in this case, a course that doesn't really represent kind of the people in Ireland, if you will. And then that causes problems downstream where the patients don't get treated by doctors that kind of understand them or that look like them or talk like them and so on. So I think the idea is to try and make the entry into medicine more equitable, and they think that making the HPAT slightly less important might be a way of doing that. I think that's kind of their idea. In terms of why now, I'm not really sure, but I think this is kind of, from what I understand, this is what they're trying to do.
Okay, so with this change, a student who's going into sixth year this year, writing their exam in 2027, or a fifth year student currently, how should they change their sort of outlook? How should they change their approach?
In terms of a sixth year, I think the approach, the big change needs to be, if possible, give your Leaving Cert even more respect. That would be the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say then is you really want to try and dial up the efficiency of your HPAT study even more than normal, because if you're the type of person who wants to apply to medicine, you want to make sure that if the HPAT ends up being really, really important, depending on your specific Leaving Cert, you want to make sure that you have the marks for that. And equally, if you don't want to do so much that kind of negatively impacts your Leaving Cert. So the main adjustment I would make is trying to just be super efficient in all of your study, so that no matter what happens, you put yourself in a good place. Whereas before, it might have been possible that if you focused a lot on your HPAT, and then after the mocks, you just really focus on your Leaving Cert, that between the two of them, you'd kind of get by, and that's probably going to change a little bit.
And you just mentioned the mocks there. So
yeah.
I think up until now, a lot of students would opt out of sitting their mocks in January to focus on their HPAT. So now that there is, let's say, a greater focus on the Leaving Cert while also trying to keep up your HPAT, would you still advise that approach, or, maybe sit all your mocks?
I usually tell students to take responsibility for what's happening and just think about what they want to do. And then whatever it is, I usually just support them. That's generally my approach. I'm pro mock personally. I think it's a good idea to do mocks. I think it's a good idea to do mocks when you're not prepared, because it shows you what you're not good at and also shows you where your strengths are. I don't really think the new changes the new HPAT changes affects your decision making. I would just say, you get months of notice that your mocks are coming. Do your best, study as much as you can, keep the HPAT in mind, and remember that there's no actual consequence for doing badly in the mocks. Like, if you do poorly because you haven't studied, that's okay, because by the time the Leaving Cert comes around, you will have studied, and therefore, you'll be okay. So those are kind of be the two things I'd be really pushing on students, that mocks are good. It's good practice to show you where your strengths and weaknesses are, and B, if you do badly, nothing bad will happen. It doesn't affect anything, really.
Yeah, so I think a primary question that a lot of students, especially parents, may have is, does this change to the HPAT bring, a change to the type of student who gets into medicine? With the greater focus on the Leaving Cert, does that affect the type of student?
It might do. I don't know. It would be years before we had any idea, really, if it does that. In terms of anything actionable that you can do, I don't really think it changes anything, really. If it does, I mean, that's great. If it doesn't, that's okay too. I don't think it changes anything from a student perspective, and I certainly wouldn't go too far into this idea that, the HPAT, the way it currently is, maybe suits me better, and therefore I'm more likely to get into medicine, or the way the changes I've made, this makes me less likely to do well. I wouldn't kind of subscribe to that thought. I would just kind of try to be as even as I could if I was a student now, and just be like, look, the changes are the changes. Just do your best and see what happens.
And I've heard a lot of students who've just finished their Leaving Cert worry that, if they wanted to repeat their Leaving Cert or go the grad entry route, does the changes in the HPAT affect them?
So the changes in the HPAT do affect them, but not in the way that would kind of be intuitive. So the big changes for the current, the guys who've just done their Leaving Cert, is that they have done their Leaving Cert in a version of the undergraduate medicine pathway where the HPAT's really, really important. So where they, I think, might suffer a little bit is they may have done more Leaving Cert study if they knew the HPAT would end up being less important, because the difference between 590 and 613 for them would have been very little. But for applying next year, it's a huge difference. It could cost you your position in medicine, basically. So what I would say is that it might affect them, unfortunately, but not really because of the HPAT too much. It'll affect them because if they knew this was going to happen, they might have studied differently when they were doing their Leaving Cert study.
So we've kind of talked a lot about the changes here. So if you were to guess what medicine entry in Ireland would look like from, let's say, 10 years from now,
Yeah.
what would you assume?
Like, if I was being a pessimist, I would say very similar to what we have now. Probably this will go on for a while and then they'll change it again. The optimist in me would say that they would add on some third kind of element of application. Ireland is one of the very few application systems in the world where it's just exam based. It's just exam and results. There's for undergraduate students for the the country that are applying. So for an Irish undergraduate student, you don't have to interview, you don't have to write a personal kind of statement or anything like that. And I think there's some merit in having that as part of the application process. And if you adjust the weighting of the interview, it might make it so that the student population is more representative of the people in Ireland. So I think I'd love in 10 years if there was maybe the interview was also part of your performance and that lends itself to your entry. I think it'd be a good addition if they could manage to do it.
Well, yeah, with these current changes, I hope that does come into place. It does sound like a good idea and definitely a lot more, what's the word? It's not so, you get to understand the person when they speak.
It's more, I think it's something a lot of students would prefer than the pressure of, there's pressure on everything, but I think it adds a layer of, it gives you a different chance to show your skills and show your suitability for being a doctor.
So we've talked quite a bit already, but for a student who's listening in, let's say, 5th year or 6th year, what's one key thing you'd like them to take away from today's conversation?
So I think the big thing to take away, not that we haven't really mentioned it a huge amount so far actually, is that for all of the kind of intellectual exercise that goes into the HPAT, for as much effort and time and at times tears that goes into your HPAT study, generally the feedback I get from students is that the most important aspect of HPAT performance is the mental side of things. Your mentality, your mindset, how you talk to yourself, how you deal with setbacks when you're studying, those kind of things are the things that make the difference. And you asked about the difference between a 50 and 100th percentile student, and I said that it's got to do with the efficiency of their study, and that is true. But if you ask me the difference between, say, the 75th and the 80th, or 75th and the 90th, for example, or the 90th and the 100th, generally that's all mindset. Generally, it's all mentality. It's your ability to deal with the emotional challenges of studying for the HPAT and just keep going the way you're supposed to and trust that the things you're doing will eventually pay off. That's despite the fact that is not in any textbook anywhere. That generally is the stuff that after they do the exam or after I meet successful students afterwards, that's usually the teaching that they always speak the highliest of, is the amount of mental preparation that goes into the HPAT and how high yield that mental preparation ends up being.
Yeah, and you were talking about a healthy mindset. So I think the time where that really comes to challenge is certainly the night before the HPAT exam. All that practice, it's a really stressful time. So what would you advise students to do that night?
Yeah, so the night before the HPAT, I would say it's really important to do no HPAT at all. It's very important to just do things that calm you down, chill you out. At that stage, you've done what you're going to do. You've become whoever you're going to become. And at that stage, it's just figuring out, what makes you relaxed and doing that. And then having a routine about when you want to go to sleep, when you want to wake up, what time is your exam the following day, and just committing to relaxing enough that you're in the right place to perform. The way I'd always describe it is you have to think of yourself as a high performance athlete, basically. So in whatever sport makes sense to you, but the day before the World Cup final, none of the Spanish players are doing anything particularly intense. They're all relaxing because they know they're good at football. They know no amount of training the day before is going to make much difference. What will make a difference is being calm and relaxed on the pitch and letting your skills do the talking. And the HPAT is very similar. So even in the 2 weeks before the HPAT, I usually tell students to start doing gradually less and less, to start that kind of tapering process down so that when you actually get to the exam, you're really excited to get it over with, because you'll definitely be excited to get it over with, but also that you're just ready to kind of burst out the tracks basically. And you've got all this energy and you can just attack the exam because you don't want to be tired going into the exam because the exam itself is very tiring.
Yeah, certainly. And you mentioned relaxing and staying calm. So that's a huge part of looking after our mental health, especially in 6th year when we already have so much pressure on top of us. So in relation to the HPAT, how would you advise looking after our mental health when it comes to practice?
Yeah, definitely. I think even just recognizing that it is important is a really good first step. A lot of people won't even do that. So that's one thing. A really important thing I would say is realizing, and this sounds paradoxical, realizing it is not the end of the world if you do not get the HPAT. For example, I did not get the HPAT the first time. The first time I applied to medicine, I missed medicine by 2 points. Then I resat it again, and then I got in. I would say maybe 10 to 20% of the people in my year are in the similar position to me. When you become a doctor, nobody cares if you did the HPAT once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, or grad med. So in the grand scheme of things, ironically, the HPAT doesn't really matter. And what you'll find is that when you think about that, when you accept that, I always describe it as you feel liberated. It's kind of like the pressure's off, the shackles are off. Now you can just perform. So sometimes it's very important in the context of the HPAT to let go a little bit and just realize, look, if I don't get it, I don't get it. Stressing and worrying about it doesn't really lend itself to me performing any better. So I'll just kind of calm down, basically, try and chill out a little bit. And then in terms of how you do that, I would always think about it as an active process. So try to be the person you want to be on the day of the exam. Try and think the way you want to think. Try and talk to yourself the way you want to talk, i.e. positive self-talk, at as many steps as you can as you're studying. Because you can't just show up to the exam with this kind of amazing positive mentality, some like amazing positive self-talk. You really have to practice it so that even when you're under more pressure than you've ever been in your life, your academic life anyways, you can still remember to do all these things. And that's ultimately the most important advice, really, is just practice being the person you want to be on the day of the exam.
Yeah, and you said that, to remember it's not the end of the world. And I think that's really relieving for a lot of students to hear, because it's just so much pressure, so much desire to be there in college doing medicine that often we just forget, like, we can do this again.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, I always feel like when I teach students, part of me is just teaching a younger version of myself, basically. And what I often find in students is that when you're in 6th year, it doesn't really matter what school you're in, but when you're in 6th year, I mean, everything is so focused on 6th year, then college, 6th year, then college. I'm going to go to Trinity, UCD, or RCSI, or whatever it is, maybe Galway if you live on the west of Ireland. And the reality is, like, once you get in, none of it matters. If it took you 1 year, it doesn't matter. If it took you 2 years, it doesn't matter. By the time you graduate, it's not like the best doctors are the ones who got the 100th percentile, for example. So there's so much else that matters. There's so many other places you can study Ireland, so many other places you can study medicine than just undergraduate medicine in Ireland. That just that much, just realizing, okay, if I don't get medicine in Ireland the first time, I'm still, just as smart a person. I'm not a complete idiot. I'm not an embarrassment, or not bringing shame to anyone, or all these things. If you can just do that, that is such a win, because I know myself, I would have saved myself a lot of time and kind of sadness or frustration if I was just a bit nicer to myself about not getting it the first time, that I was still a reasonably smart guy. I was still, a good student or a good person, or I'd still become a good teacher, or the fact that I didn't get it the first time doesn't mean I'm going to be some terrible doctor. If you can try and dispel some of those kind of toxic mindsets about yourself, your performance will really increase.
Yeah, and like you said, often it's just like a misunderstanding that we have with ourselves. We just have to put a bit more faith in ourselves. So that really brings me on to my next question, which is, what are some myths or misconceptions that students have about the HPAT?
Yeah, there's lots. I mean, the biggest misconception I find parents and students have is that this idea that everyone who gets the HPAT is a genius, or everyone who gets into medicine is just some absolutely incredible student. Yes, many of them are, but it's not like everybody is some robot, photographic memory, all this kind of stuff. So that's one thing. One myth that I see a lot is, it's an aptitude test. You can't study for it. You can definitely improve. Another myth, I suppose, is that, some of the things the HPAT tests, you can't improve or you can't study on, or some things you just either have or you don't. Like, for instance, some people think Section 3 is kind of like that. But what I would say is that you can study for every part of the exam pretty much if you are focused enough on improving that specific like topic or task or whatever it is. So the biggest myth about, you know, your ability or your performance being fixed is just false. If it were true, nobody would improve the second time, but loads of people improve the second time or the third time. So you can absolutely improve. If you have any myths that you've heard, I'd be happy to address them, but that's kind of the big one that I see a lot.
And just talking about myths and, you know, misconceptions, what's a mistake that you see high achieving students make in specific?
I think one issue I see students have a lot that trips them up is this idea that you can control everything with the HPAT. You know, that HPAT is like your leaving cert. You can predict what questions come up. You can predict where they'll come up. You can predict what order you're going to do the exam in. And none of those things are true. There's a lot of unknowns with the HPAT, and you have to accept that they are an unknown, and you cannot know them ahead of time. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. The unknowns will still exist. You could still show up to the HPAT and it could start pouring down rain and your internet will cut out and you'll just have to do the exam another day. Like, that just might happen. Okay. It's an online exam, which means you're probably going to do it from home, which means your neighbor may decide to mow their lawn repeatedly the whole exam. You can't control that. So there's no point worrying about it. So this kind of idea of accepting there are certain things you can control, and there are lots you can't. And often the students who do well are really good at just accepting that this is what I can control. This is what I'm going to focus on. Everything outside of that is outside of that. And then whatever happens, happens. You know, getting really bogged down into controlling things you can't control or that it doesn't really help to control, I often find that really trips people up.
And that is a lovely mindset to have, to let go of things you can't control, because it all comes down to, you know, looking after yourself. And yeah, that's lovely advice to give.
Yeah, at the end of the day, like, it's very difficult to conceptualize how narrow the margins between success and failure are in this exam. And the only time it will happen is actually when you talk to people, like when you get in, for example, and in the first few weeks of college, inevitably the HPAT will come up and you realize, like, the difference between people who got the 98th percentile and the 91st percentile is tiny. It's tiny. And reality is that difference between somebody who misses medicine by 1 point and gets medicine by 1 point is minuscule. So the more relaxed you can be in the exam, if that gives you a 10% edge, a 5% edge, if you just perform 2 questions better because you are 10% more relaxed, like, that could be the difference between you getting in and not. And so that's why it's just so important. That's why I emphasize so much the mental side of the HPAT, why letting go or just accepting what you can't control. Because all of that stuff lends itself to you being more relaxed and composed when you get to the exam. And because guessing is such an important part of the test, because it's multiple choice, just being more calm so that you can guess slightly better could very well be the reason you get into medicine versus you don't.
So you mentioned how, you know, it's ideal for students to start studying from August till their HPAT exam. So when it comes to your teaching, how do you sort of ramp up your teaching?
Yeah, so as we get closer to the exam, we usually try to tackle and talk about more complicated topics. So the big thing for students to get straight in their heads, and the reason why it's not so useful to start really early, is that as you get into December and January and then February, although it's mostly December and January, your study goes, you know, you supercharge it. The intensity is much higher. Quite frankly, the desperation is much higher. And that's a completely normal part of the study. So in some ways, the classes do kind of, replicate that or try and push you a little bit to push yourself. But the reality is, I mean, students of this caliber, they'll push themselves enough. You know, often it's me actually pulling them back and saying, you know, you need to go a bit slower. So it's really important that when you do that in December and January, that you are really focused on the goal, but to remember that if your study schedule has been, say, an hour a day, roughly-ish, you know, which works out to about 7 hours a week, that you don't all of a sudden go to 30 hours a week. You know, that's not the solution. That when you are in that really crunch period of your HPAT preparation, it's so important not to completely lose sight of everything else, not lose sight of your personal life, your, you know, diet, health, your school studies. That yes, ramping up means being really intense, but it doesn't mean HPAT over everything else in your life. And then the other thing, and this is again kind of explains why I don't like studying super early for the HPAT, is that when you get a cohort of highly motivated, highly accomplished students and they realize 8 weeks from the HPAT, oh my God, I'm not good at the HPAT right now. There is an intensity and focus to their study that you cannot possibly replicate 11 months from the exam. And it's because of that that I don't really recommend studying early, because when you get 8 weeks away and realize you still can't pick the middle in section 3, you'll really start studying, and that's normal. But just, not to lose sight of the fact that, 5 hours of HPAT study is very rarely the answer to anyone's problems.
And, we talked about mental health and mindset. So I think even in some cases, more than students, I feel like parents have the most concern. So how can they support their children?
Yeah, parents can support their children, I think, in whatever way that makes sense to them. The key things to keep in mind, though, for parents, I find, for these students is, one, to obviously know your child and support them the way you think makes sense. But often to just give them space is usually the best way, because your HPAT study will not improve in a linear fashion. You will not continually get better. Sometimes you'll go forward, sometimes you'll go backward. And it can be hard to kind of come to the dinner table and be like, how did you do? Oh, I got the 30th percentile. How did you get the 30th percentile? You got the 60th percentile last week. That kind of conversation, it doesn't help. It usually only makes it worse. So what I would say for parents is to just give their children space a lot of the time to go however they're going. Because often, especially at the high performing student level, if you can just create an environment where the student realizes, look, if I have a problem, I can tell mom and dad, and that they make it very clear that, if I don't do well, it'll be fine. It's not like they will love me less if I don't get into medicine, or, they will like me less, or things like that. And, you'd be surprised how far that can go, to just have a supportive, loving environment at home, because the HPAT will put them under a lot of pressure most of the time.
Yeah, and talking about support from parents, I think a lot of parents may not know a lot about the HPAT, and hopefully they will know through this podcast. But, if they're not from, let's say they're coming from another country and they're new to the Irish education system, they may not know that they're adding pressure to their child when it comes to the HPAT and pushing them to go further. So what's your sort of experience in that? What have you seen other students tell you?
Students supporting students is a huge part of the HPAT, and ideally, you meet your friends in school are also doing the HPAT. The Grind 360 in-person workshops are a good way of meeting new people who are doing the HPAT, or actually just using the chat function when in the weekly classes. And the whole point is, you're right, it's very difficult for anyone who's not done the HPAT to understand how emotionally and kind of mentally challenging the HPAT is. And so in that way, I would 100% recommend either study groups where it's you and your friends, or if not, just people you can talk to about the HPAT who will understand what you're saying, because so much of the HPAT is in your own head, and just being able to express whatever's going on. Again, you'd be amazed how beneficial that can be.
And, talking about support from students, what sort of advice or learning can students take from current medical students?
Yeah, so the overriding theme you will get in medicine, actually, and this is kind of true for every level, is when you talk to people ahead of you, they will usually just say some version of, I wish I just relaxed more at your stage. That's like the prevailing theme. And the number one thing a student right now who wants to be an undergraduate medical student in Ireland can learn from current undergraduate medical students is that everyone who gets into medicine is just a normal person who was pretty good at school. That's it. They're not incredibly special. It is not the 100 smartest people in Ireland are Trinity Med students. They're all super normal. They all have the exact same problems as we do, or as you do, or as she does, or as he does. And that there's no need to put these people on a pedestal that they are somehow smarter than you, or better than you, or harder working than you. They are virtually the same as you, because I find if you put people on a pedestal, you start to think, well, I'm not as smart as them. I'm not going to get this because I have to work really hard for my exams. Except, well, so do they. We have to work really hard for our exams. We were also terrible at organic chemistry the first time. Everyone who gets into medicine is just a normal person who did well in the HPAT and the Leaving Cert. There's nothing remarkable about them. And certainly if there is anything remarkable about them, there's nothing remarkable about them that you can't also be. And so you are more alike than you will realize until you get in. That's what I would say.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. A massive thank you to our guest from Grind 360 for coming down and honestly making the HPAT sound a lot less terrifying. If you're one of the 1,000 students out there who's thinking of probably writing the HPAT, hopefully today's conversation has left you with a plan instead of just panicking. So start early and have plenty of practice in. So if you found today's conversation even just a little bit helpful, do me a favor. Please send it to a friend and follow us for more episodes. So until next time, good luck and see you in the next one.